He lost his entire family. In one night, 20 years later, a forgotten box reveals the truth. The night that changed everything. The night sky over Vermont was clear and still, the kind of stillness that makes a place feel safe. Snow rested softly on rooftops, and the wind hummed quietly through pine trees. But inside the Whitman family home, that illusion of safety was about to be shattered forever. 9-year-old Eli Whitman was already in bed, tucked in beneath layers of flannel and warmth, when it began. He would never be able to tell exactly what woke him, whether it was the sound, the heat, or some whisper in his bones. But something roused him, pulled him out of the half-sleep of childhood and into a waking nightmare. Smoke curled beneath his bedroom door. The air was thick, the silence broken only by the soft crackle of something burning. He called out for his mother, for his father, for Lily, his little sister, but no one answered. His legs carried him, barefoot, across the wooden floor and into the hallway. That's where memory stops. He doesn't remember the flames. He doesn't remember the screams. He doesn't remember how he got outside. But that's where the firefighters found him, on the lawn, shivering, eyes wide and empty, while the house burned behind him. In the hospital, when he finally woke, they asked him the same questions over and over again. Do you remember what happened? Did you see anyone? Where were your parents? He shook his head every time, and then, in a whisper that grew more desperate by the day, he began asking his own, "Where's my mom? Where's Dad? Where's Lily?" No one had answers. The house had burned too hot, too fast. No bodies were ever found, just ashes, scorched wood, and the steel skeletons of what used to be a life. Some said it was a tragic accident, a gas leak, an electrical fault, a cruel twist of fate. Others, in hushed tones, wondered if there was more to it. But for Eli, there was only one truth. His family was gone, and he was alone. He was placed in foster care, then adopted by a kind but distant couple, the Kavanaughs, who moved him out of state and tried to give him a fresh start. They never spoke about the fire. They didn't ask about the past. They only gave him what he needed to keep going. Food, school, a room of his own, and space to heal. But Eli never really healed. He grew up quiet, cautious, afraid of fire, afraid of crowds, afraid of getting too close to anyone. He didn't trust memory. It betrayed him once. By 19, he was drifting. By 25, he avoided birthdays and holidays. By 29, he lived in a one-bedroom apartment, worked overnight cleaning offices, and didn't talk to anyone unless he had to. No friends, no relationships, no history. Until the letter came. It arrived on a Thursday. The rain had been coming down all afternoon, slicking the sidewalks and smearing the windows. Eli was sorting through his mail, mostly junk when he found it. Plain white envelope, no return address, postmarked from Maplewood, Vermont. He hadn't seen that name in 20 years. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was neat, steady. Eli, I know you don't remember me, but I knew your family. Your aunt, Miriam, passed away last month. In her will, she left something for you. If you want it, come home. No pressure. Just, maybe it's time. LT. That was it. No explanation. Just an address scribbled at the bottom. Eli held the letter for a long time. He didn't remember any Aunt Miriam. He didn't remember most of his childhood before the fire. But something in those words stirred something in him, something that had been buried, locked tight for years. Maybe it was grief, maybe guilt, maybe curiosity, or maybe, just maybe, it was hope. Hope that not everything had been lost. He called out of work, packed a small bag, left a note for his landlord, and the next morning, just as the sun began to rise behind gray clouds, Eli started driving. Back to Vermont, back to Maplewood, back to the place where everything ended, and where, without knowing it, a new beginning was already waiting. The boy who survived, the man who forgot. The road into Maplewood hadn't changed much. The pine trees still lined the highway like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with late winter frost. The familiar curves of the old town signs, the faded gas station on the corner, the diner with its chipped red awning, they all stood like frozen echoes of a life Eli no longer recognized. It had been 20 years since he'd driven these roads, 20 years since the fire, since everything. The address from the letter led him to a narrow street tucked behind the town library. The house at the end was modest, pale blue, with peeling paint and ivy clinging to one side. The windows were dusty, but not broken. The porch sagged a little. A wind chime jingled softly as he climbed the steps. He knocked once, then again. No answer. Just as he turned to leave, the door creaked open. A woman stood there, older, maybe late 50s, wearing a sweater 2 sizes too big, and a look of quiet curiosity. She squinted at him for a moment. "You must be Eli." He nodded. "I'm Lorna. Lorna Tate. I was your aunt, Miriam's neighbor." She opened the door wider, motioning for him to come inside. The air smelled like cinnamon and something older books, maybe. Dust and wood polish and time. "Your aunt passed away last month, peacefully, in her sleep. She didn't have many visitors those last few years, but she always asked about you." Eli blinked. "I don't remember her." "I know," Lorna said gently, "but she remembered you. Every year on your birthday, she made a little cake, said she didn't know where to send it, so she just ate it herself and said a prayer." He wasn't sure what to say to that. Lorna led him down a narrow hallway, into a small room filled with plants and books. On the table sat a wooden box, not large, not ornate, just old. "She left this for you," Lorna said. "Wouldn't let anyone else touch it." Eli stepped forward slowly, drawn by something he couldn't explain. He reached out and brushed his fingers across the lid. It was smooth, worn from use, carved with 3 letters, E-W-H, his initials. He lifted the lid. Inside were stacks of paper, a few photographs, a folded cloth, and beneath it all, a journal. His breath caught. He picked up the first photo. It was faded and curling at the edges, but he recognized the faces immediately. His mother, his father, and himself, maybe 4 years old, standing between them in front of a snowman. "I don't remember this," he whispered. Lorna sat across from him. "That's okay. Sometimes memory comes back when it's ready." He flipped to the next photo. His sister, Lily, sitting on a swing, mid-laugh, hair caught in motion. She would have been around 6 in that picture. There was a lump in his throat now, growing fast. He opened the journal. The first page was addressed to him. "If you're reading this, Eli, it means you came back. I don't know how much you remember. Maybe nothing. Maybe too much. But this is the truth of what happened, at least, what I know of it. And it's time you knew too. His hands trembled. Lorna stood quietly. I'll give you some space, she said, and stepped out of the room. Eli stared at the journal for a long time before turning the page. The next entry was dated 3 months before the fire. Your father had secrets, not the kind that destroy families, not yet, but the kind that grow roots in silence. Something changed in him that year. He stopped going to the job site, started locking his study door. He got quiet, short-tempered. Your mother tried to talk to him. I saw her come by my house one night, crying. She never used to cry. Eli's heartbeat quickened. He turned the page. Then there were the calls. Late at night, always after you kids were asleep. I only know because I was up with a migraine and heard the phone through the open window. One night, she screamed at him, said the words threat and our children and we should leave. And then, the fire. He stopped reading, stood up, pushed the chair back so fast it squeaked against the wood. Outside the window, the wind was picking up. But it wasn't the cold that made his skin crawl. It was the dawning realization that maybe the fire hadn't been an accident, that maybe the life he'd lost hadn't simply burned away, but had been taken, deliberately, with purpose. He picked up the folded cloth from the box. It was a baby blanket Lily's, her initials stitched into the corner. Beneath it, taped to the bottom of the box, was a single key. Not a house key, something older, brass, heavy. Beside it, a small tag. Storage 119. Maplewood Lock and Keep. Paid through 2030. His hands clenched. That was less than 10 minutes from here. He put everything back in the box, careful not to disturb the photos. When he turned around, Lorna was standing in the doorway, arms folded. There's more, isn't there? She asked. He nodded slowly. I think so. She hesitated, then stepped forward. Eli, if you're going to start digging into the past, you need to know something. What? Your father wasn't just a builder. He had investments. Friends and places people like us don't ask questions about. Miriam always suspected something bad happened that night, but no one would listen. Eli felt the walls shift around him. Nothing was solid anymore. Why didn't she tell the police? She tried. They called her paranoid, said trauma messes with memories. He looked down at the box again, suddenly feeling very, very tired. Why now? He asked. Why tell me now? Lorna shrugged. Maybe because you're ready. Or maybe because what was buried is finally rising to the surface. Either way, this isn't just about grief anymore. Eli closed the box. No, it's about the truth. And for the first time since he was 9 years old, he wasn't running from it. He was walking straight into it. The key beneath the ashes. The air in Maplewood Lock and Keep was thick with silence, and the faint chemical scent of aged cardboard and rusted metal. A row of motion sensor lights flickered overhead as Eli stepped through the main corridor, the key from his aunt's box clutched tightly in his hand. The receptionist had barely looked up when he mentioned the number storage 119 and handed him a clipboard. She simply waved him through. As he walked past rows of identical metal doors, something about the place made the hairs on the back of his neck rise. Maybe it was the stillness, or maybe it was the fact that he didn't know what he was walking into. The key was cold and smooth in his palm, but it felt heavier than it should have, like it had been waiting for decades to be used. Door 119 was at the very end of the hallway. A dented brass plate bore the number, and the lock below it was old school. No digital keypad, no passcode, just a traditional keyhole. Eli inserted the key. It turned with a satisfying click, though the sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet corridor. He pulled the door open slowly. Dust swirled in the beam of light, spilling in from the hallway. The storage unit was small, maybe 10 by 10, with a few boxes stacked against the back wall, and a covered object to the left. A faded tarp concealed something long and rectangular. He stepped inside, heart pounding. The first box he opened was filled with paperwork. Folders, some labeled Everhart Trust, and others with dates, 1997, 1998. There were old financial statements, blueprints for properties across the state, even letters with government letterheads. One envelope caught his attention immediately. It was addressed to his father, Aaron W. Holloway, from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. The return address had been blacked out with marker. He set the letter aside and moved to the tarp. The fabric came away in a single breathless tug. Underneath was a large wooden crate, sealed with a latch. It reminded Eli of the kind of container used for shipping artifacts or military supplies. He undid the latch slowly and opened the lid. Inside were items that didn't belong together. A child's stuffed rabbit, its ears worn down from use, a silver locket, inside of which was a photo of his mother and Lily, a VHS tape with no label, a revolver wrapped in cloth, and a journal. Not his aunt's, his father's. He stared at the items for a long moment, the breath caught in his throat. These weren't just belongings. They were pieces of a life that had been deliberately hidden. He picked up the VHS tape first. There were still a few old players at thrift stores, maybe even one at the house if Lorna hadn't thrown it out. He set it aside carefully. The gun he didn't touch again. He took the journal and sat cross-legged on the cold concrete floor. The cover was plain, leather, worn at the edges. When he opened it, the first thing he saw wasn't words. It was a drawing. 3 stick figures. A man, a woman, a child. He flipped to the first written entry. February 3rd, 1998. I made a deal today. I didn't want to, but they left me no choice. It's for the kids. I keep telling myself that. For Rachel and the children. If I don't play ball, they'll take everything. Eli's throat tightened. Rachel, his mother. He read on. It started with that development outside Maplewood, the one I was asked to approve for state funding. I said no. It was over budget, unstable land. I wasn't going to be a rubber stamp. Then came the threats. They said they'd make it look like an accident, a fire, that no one would question it if the whole thing went up in flames. I didn't believe them. God help me. I didn't believe them. Eli stopped. The journal slipped from his hands. Everything in him screamed that this couldn't be real, that it was some fever dream, a twisted lie his father had written in a moment of madness. But it matched the pieces in his aunt's journal. The late-night phone calls, the sudden change. The storage unit didn't just hold family heirlooms. It held evidence. He snapped a photo of the pages with his phone, hands shaking. He would read the rest later. For now, he had to know. Had anyone else found this before him? There was dust on the boxes, thick layers, but the crate's latch had been recently oiled. It moved too smoothly. Someone had opened this before. Was it Miriam or someone else? He returned the items carefully, save for the journal and the tape. He tucked those under his arm, locked the unit, and walked quickly down the hall. The receptionist looked up briefly as he passed. Find what you needed? She asked. Yeah, he replied, voice flat. More than I wanted. Outside, the wind had picked up. He stood by his car for a long moment, staring at the gray sky. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang. He had come back to Maplewood, searching for memories. Instead, he had found secrets. He drove back to the house with a white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel. Lorna was in the kitchen when he returned, nursing a cup of tea. She looked up and frowned. You're pale, she said. Paler than usual. Eli dropped the journal on the table. My father knew it would happen, the fire. He wrote about it. She didn't look surprised. I thought he might. You knew? I suspected. Miriam did too. But back then, there was no one to tell. The sheriff was in their pocket. So were half the developers in town. Eli opened his mouth to speak, but a sudden knocking at the door interrupted him. 3 sharp raps. Lorna's face went still. No one knows you're here, she said. They exchanged a look. Then she rose slowly, crossed the room, and peered through the curtain. It's Sheriff Nolan, she whispered. Or rather, the man who used to be sheriff. Eli stood. Let him in. This time, he wanted answers. Letters never sent. The house on Cypress Hollow stood silent beneath the early autumn sky, the orange-gold leaves drifting down like whispers from the past. Inside, Nathan sat alone in the attic, his fingers running along the brittle edges of a dust-covered box, labeled only with a single word in faded ink. Mom. He hadn't opened this box in over 20 years, not since the night of the fire. The house had survived. His family had not. It was the truth he'd lived with every day. But something about yesterday's discovery. A newspaper clipping buried in a hidden desk compartment, referencing the investigation being inconclusive, had cracked open a part of his memory that he had locked away. Nathan brushed aside the top layer. Old birthday cards, faded receipts, a crayon drawing of a stick figure family labeled Us. And then he found them, bundles of letters tied with ribbon, addressed but never mailed. His mother's handwriting, familiar and elegant. Each envelope had a name. His father, his sister, his grandmother, even one for him. He opened his own first. Nathan, if you are reading this, it means I didn't get to say goodbye, and I'm so sorry for that. I know this letter won't fix the questions in your heart, but I hope it will help you understand a little more about who we were and who we tried to be. Nathan sat back, tears pricking his eyes. The letter spoke of her hopes, her fears, and a shadow that had hung over their family, something about his father being involved with people who never forgot a debt. She mentioned strange calls at night, hushed conversations, and the growing tension that consumed their once warm household. It wasn't specific, but the fear behind her words was unmistakable. She ended with a promise. You have more strength in you than you know. One day, when the time is right, you'll find out the truth. And when you do, remember who you are. All my love, Mom. Nathan held the letter to his chest. His mother had known something dangerous. He reread the line. When the time is right. Was that time now? He opened the other letters, one by one. Most were reflections, private messages meant for each family member. But one stood out, addressed not to a family member, but to a man Nathan had never heard of. Walter Hartley. Inside was a folded sheet of paper and a key. Walter, if anything happens to me or the children, you know what to do. The safety deposit box at Fairhaven Bank. Box 317. The truth is inside. Don't let them rewrite what really happened. And don't trust anyone, not even the ones wearing badges. Nathan stared at the letter. The Fairhaven Bank still existed. He'd driven past it on his way to work 100 times, never knowing it held a key to his past. But who was Walter Hartley? He took out his laptop and started digging. It didn't take long. A local obituary listed a Walter T. Hartley, who had passed away 5 years ago. He had no children, but the tribute mentioned he was a retired private investigator who had devoted his later years to solving cold cases others had abandoned. A photograph accompanied the article. A man in a trench coat, sharp-eyed even in old age. And beside him, a woman Nathan recognized instantly, his mother. The caption read, "Partners in Justice, Olivia Wade and Walter Hartley, during their early days working missing persons cases." Nathan's heart pounded. His mother wasn't just a social worker. She had once been an investigator, and she had left behind secrets that someone had wanted buried. He knew what he had to do. The next morning, Nathan took the key and the letter to Fairhaven Bank. The teller eyed him skeptically at first, but when he presented the envelope and the key, she made a call and then escorted him to a private room. An older man arrived, Mr. Delaney, the bank's manager. "I remember Walter," Delaney said, running the key through a carded inventory. "He came by often. Said this box wasn't his, but he was keeping it safe for a friend. Said one day someone would come looking for it, and that we'd know when it was time." Delaney unlocked the deposit box and slid it across the table. Nathan hesitated. Then he opened it. Inside were several manila folders, photographs, and a voice recorder. The first folder was labeled Case 1482, the Wade family disappearance. It wasn't just a mystery to the world. It had been an open case, investigated by someone who had refused to give up. The photos were grainy, some taken from a distance. One showed a man Nathan couldn't place, standing outside their home days before the fire. Another showed a black van parked near the woods behind the house. And then there was a transcript. Call from OW to WH, October 7th, 2003. OW, they've started watching again. I think they know I've been digging. WH, you sure it's the same people? OW, I'm not sure of anything anymore, but Nathan said he saw someone by the shed last night. He thought it was a dream, but I don't know. I'm scared, Walter. WH, then it's time. Pack a bag. I'll be there by morning. OW, I can't just leave. Not without proof. Not again. Nathan listened to the recording. His mother's voice shook with fear, and behind it, something deeper. Resolve. He went through every page, every piece of evidence, until the sun began to set. It became clear that someone had been targeting his mother, that the fire might not have been an accident, and that he, as a child, had survived something darker than he'd ever known. The final document in the box was a list of names, people Olivia had contacted in the months before the fire. 3 names were crossed out. 1 name wasn't. Marianne Lee, last seen, 2004. Status, unknown. And next to it, in Walter's handwriting, find her. She holds the missing thread. Nathan closed the box. He had thought the story ended the night his family vanished, but now he knew it hadn't even begun. Beneath the ashes. The town of Ellison Ridge hadn't changed much since the fire that claimed the Langston house. But Daniel Langston had. 20 years ago, he was just a boy with soot-streaked cheeks and a hollow look in his eyes. Now, he stood at the edge of the property line with a cautious sense of return. The grass had grown wild over what was once a manicured lawn, and the outline of the house's foundation was barely visible under layers of weeds and moss. But for Daniel, it was sacred ground, not because of what had burned, but because of what might still lie buried. Armed with a shovel, gloves, and a head full of questions, Daniel started digging. His hands worked methodically, each shovelful of earth a step closer to understanding the night that had unraveled his entire world. What had the letter meant by "search where the fire couldn't reach"? He remembered the root cellar, tucked behind the house beneath a stone slab. It had survived the blaze, but had been boarded up by the authorities after the investigation. No one had returned to it, until now. He cleared away the overgrowth, heart pounding with a mix of dread and anticipation. The old cellar door creaked open with resistance, the hinges protesting years of neglect. Inside, the air was thick and cold, untouched by sunlight. Daniel switched on his flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing shelves lined with glass jars of preserved fruit, now long since spoiled. Cobwebs clung to every corner. And then, tucked behind an old wooden crate, he saw it, a small, rusted lockbox. The box was heavier than it looked. He brought it outside, brushed off the dirt, and pried it open. Inside were several objects wrapped in waxed paper, a stack of photographs, a locket, a journal, and something that made Daniel's breath hitch, a cassette tape marked simply, "To my son." He didn't wait. Back at his motel room, Daniel borrowed an old tape player from the front desk. "You'd be surprised what we keep in Lost and Found," the clerk said with a wink. He slid the cassette in, pressed play, and braced himself. A woman's voice filled the room, warm, familiar, trembling. "Daniel, if you're hearing this, it means you found the box, that you came home." It was his mother. "I don't know how much they told you. I don't know what they let you remember, but I need you to know the truth. About the fire, about our family, about why I had to make a choice no mother should ever face." Daniel sank into the bed, eyes locked on the tape player, as his mother's words unraveled a story he had never dared imagine. It wasn't an accident, the fire. It wasn't faulty wiring or a candle left burning. It was deliberate, and it wasn't supposed to take you. Daniel clenched the edge of the mattress. "I found something, Daniel. Something your father was involved in. Something dangerous." He thought he could control it, but he was wrong. When I threatened to go to the police, I became a liability. That night, I saw the men who set the fire. I hid you in the pantry, behind the flour sacks. I thought it would be enough." She paused. The silence on the tape was almost unbearable. "But when I came back for you, the flames were already everywhere. I screamed for you, but the smoke, the heat, I couldn't get through. I thought you were gone. I never forgave myself." Daniel covered his mouth, trying to suppress the flood of emotion. "They made it look like we all died, but I didn't. I went into hiding. I changed my name. I couldn't risk contacting you. Not until I knew they were no longer watching. Not until I could be sure you were safe." The tape clicked softly as it ended. Daniel sat in stunned silence. The woman he had mourned for 20 years wasn't dead. She had been alive. She had protected him. And she had been hunted. He opened the journal next. It was filled with entries, some mundane, others chilling. Names, dates, locations. Meetings his father had attended with men linked to something called the Hollow Syndicate, a network of influential businessmen and politicians who trafficked in secrets, silence, and fear. There were photos, too. One of them sent a chill down his spine. A man shaking his father's hand, and Daniel recognized him instantly. Sheriff Clarence Monroe, the very man who had consoled him after the fire, who had told him there was nothing left to save, who had closed the case within weeks. He was one of them. Daniel flipped back to the first page of the journal, his mother's handwriting. If you're reading this, you survived. And now it's your turn to decide. Will you run, like I did, or will you finish what we started? The motel room was quiet, but for the soft hum of the fridge. Outside, the world continued as usual. But inside Daniel, something fundamental shifted. He wasn't just the boy who had survived. He was the man who would uncover everything. He picked up the photograph of Sheriff Monroe and his father again. This time, he noticed the background a lodge, nestled in the woods, with a distinct weather vane on top. He had seen it before, on the edge of town, the old hunting lodge. His heart pounded. It was still standing. He packed the journal, the cassette, and the photos into his bag. The lockbox he buried back in the cellar, just in case. As he climbed into his rental car, Daniel glanced one last time at the scorched skeleton of his childhood home. Then he turned the key in the ignition. The past had burned down, but the truth was still smoldering, and Daniel Langston was finally ready to face the fire. The house she built without him. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he ran them over the edge of the worn-out desk, his fingers brushing against the wood that had once been part of his and Olivia's shared life. The desk stood in the corner of what had once been their office, a room filled with the scent of coffee and papers, where decisions had been made together, side by side. Now, it felt like an echo of the past, a silent reminder of what he had lost. His mind wandered back to the years before, the years when they had built this house together. It had been their dream, one they had nurtured with every brick, every nail, and every carefully planned room. They had raised their children here, watched them grow, and fought their battles within these walls. The house had been more than just a structure. It had been a testament to their love, their sacrifices, and their shared vision for the future. But now, it felt like a prison. Daniel leaned against the desk, closing his eyes, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. He had been away from this house for so long, but coming back had felt like stepping into a different world. The familiar smell of Olivia's perfume still lingered in the air, and the faint sound of her voice seemed to echo in the corners of every room. It was as if she had never truly left, even though the years without her had stretched into a painful silence. The boys, Jonah and Miles, were downstairs, cleaning up after their breakfast. Daniel had insisted they help, although they were reluctant at first. The house felt empty, despite the presence of his children. The warmth they had once shared as a family seemed like a distant memory, something to be mourned, not relived. The weight of the house, the memories, the history, all hung heavy on Daniel's shoulders. He felt like a stranger here. This place that had once been his sanctuary now felt foreign, alien. He was no longer the man who had built it with Olivia. He was a man who had failed her, a man who had walked away when she had needed him most. "Dad?" Miles's voice broke through his thoughts. Daniel turned to see his son standing in the doorway, his expression uncertain. "You all right?" Miles asked, his voice tinged with concern. "I'm fine," Daniel replied, though the tightness in his chest made it hard to speak. "Just thinking." "About Mom?" Jonah's voice, too, came from the hallway. He had joined his brother, and both of them were standing there now, looking at Daniel with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Daniel swallowed hard. It was a difficult question to answer. Yes, he was thinking about Olivia. He always was. Every decision he made, every step he took, he felt the ghost of her presence haunting him, reminding him of what he had lost and what he had failed to protect. But more than that, he was thinking about them, his sons, the boys who had been left behind in a house that had been built with love but shattered by neglect. I don't know if I can fix what's broken, Daniel murmured, almost to himself. You don't have to, Jonah said softly, his words unexpected but full of understanding. We just need you to be here, not to fix things, just be here. Daniel's heart clenched at his son's words. He had always tried to be there for them, but in so many ways, he had failed them. His absence, his emotional withdrawal after Olivia left, had left scars that were still raw and unhealed. I'm trying, Daniel said, his voice cracking with emotion. I'm trying to be the father you need me to be. Jonah gave him a small, tentative smile. Then you're doing all right. Daniel nodded, though he didn't feel it. He didn't feel like he was doing all right. There were still so many pieces of himself that needed to be put back together, and he wasn't sure if he could do it alone. I was thinking, Miles began, his voice hesitant. Maybe we could fix up the house. You know, make it feel like home again. The suggestion was simple, but it struck a chord deep within Daniel. He had avoided the house for so long, avoiding the memories that came flooding back with every room he entered. But maybe, just maybe, fixing it up would be the first step in repairing not just the house, but their family. Maybe this place could become a home again, a place where they could begin to rebuild their lives together. I think that's a good idea, Daniel said quietly, his gaze lingering on the boys. They were both looking at him, waiting for his approval, hoping for a sign that their father was ready to step back into the life they had all left behind. Let's do it, Daniel said with more conviction, his voice steady for the first time in a long while. Let's fix this place up. Let's bring it back to life. The boys nodded, a sense of quiet relief settling over them. They had been living in the shadow of their mother's absence for so long, trying to navigate a world that had become cold and unfamiliar. But now, it felt like there was a way forward, a way to reclaim what had been lost. As they moved through the house, each room felt like a puzzle that needed to be pieced together. They started in the living room, moving furniture, dusting off old furniture, and organizing the clutter that had accumulated over the years. With every step, the house began to feel less like a ghost and more like a home. Do you remember when Mom used to sit here? Jonah asked, sitting down on the old armchair that had once been Olivia's favorite spot. She always had a cup of tea, and she'd read her books for hours. Daniel smiled faintly. I remember. Maybe we can put her books back on the shelf, Miles suggested, looking around the room with a mixture of nostalgia and longing. It doesn't feel right, you know, having this place without her. Daniel nodded, the lump in his throat thickening. He hadn't expected to feel so much all at once. The boys were right. This house needed Olivia, and, in a way, it needed all of them to heal. They moved through the house, finding old photos in drawers, hidden keepsakes in the attic. Every object seemed to tell a story, every piece of furniture a chapter in their family's history. It was overwhelming, but it was also comforting. For the first time in a long time, Daniel felt like they were making progress. As the evening wore on, the house slowly transformed. It wasn't perfect. There were still signs of wear and tear, remnants of a past that couldn't be erased. But it was better. It was warmer. And for the first time in years, Daniel felt like he had found a reason to hope. The next morning, as the sun rose over the house, Daniel sat on the porch, sipping his coffee and watching the boys work. They were laughing, arguing over where to put the new furniture. But there was an energy between them that had been missing for so long. They were a family again, not perfect, but together. I think Mom would have liked it, Jonah said, looking around the yard. Daniel smiled softly. I think she would have too. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that this was the beginning of something new, something different. And that, for the first time in a long time, felt like enough. The next day, Daniel awoke to the pale morning light creeping through the cracked blinds of Olivia's old home. The house still felt heavy with the weight of the years they had spent apart, but there was something in the air, a subtle shift. For the first time in a long while, it felt like the house was breathing again, like it was waking up from a long slumber. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air as Daniel stood at the stove, watching the kettle boil. The letter he had found the night before, Olivia's final letter, still clutched in his hand, lingered in his thoughts. He hadn't been able to sleep much. Instead, he had sat in the hallway, reading her words, over and over, as if they held the answers to everything he had been searching for. He hadn't realized how much he had needed closure until it was in his hands. That evening, as he sat reading her final words, Daniel felt a knot loosen in his chest. Olivia's letter wasn't filled with blame or regret. It was filled with hope, with the kind of quiet optimism that only comes with time, forgiveness, and healing. She had written about the possibility of rebuilding, of starting over, not for her, but for them, her boys. She asked him to show them what she couldn't, to teach them how to love in ways she never could. The words felt like a gift, one he didn't deserve, but needed more than he could admit. In the distance, he heard the soft padding of footsteps. Jonah. Morning, Jonah mumbled, rubbing his eyes and stumbling into the kitchen. Daniel smiled at his son, who looked like he hadn't had much sleep either. You hungry? Jonah shrugged, then sat at the table, his head still heavy with sleep. A few moments later, Miles walked in, his hair tousled, a faint trace of the boy he used to be still visible in his movements. They ate breakfast together, the room silent except for the clink of forks on plates. But there was something different in the air, something tangible. It wasn't comfort, not yet, but it was progress. A sense of normalcy was slowly starting to take root again. After breakfast, Daniel cleared the table and glanced around the house, his mind racing with ideas. What do you two think about giving this place a little life again? He asked, looking at Jonah and Miles. Jonah looked up from his plate, surprised by the suggestion. You mean fix it up? Yeah, Daniel nodded. Bring it back to life. Not just for your memories, but maybe for your future too. Miles looked hesitant, but intrigued. How do we even start? Well, Daniel said, walking to the living room. Let's start with what we know best. We'll begin with the living room. Move some furniture around, make it feel less like a museum and more like, well, like a home. Together, they started moving the heavy armchair Olivia used to sit in. revealing forgotten photo albums tucked underneath. They sat on the floor, flipping through pages, the air thick with memories. "That's Mom when she was pregnant," Miles whispered, pointing to a photo. "That might have been when she was carrying us." Daniel traced the edge of the photo with his finger. "She looks peaceful," he murmured. "She was," Jonah added quietly. "At least, that's how she wanted us to remember her." They continued cleaning for hours, the work a quiet reflection of their shared history. In the attic, they found boxes labeled Spring Fair and library projects. In the garage, Daniel uncovered old wooden tools, many of which Olivia had repurposed into art when she couldn't afford paint or canvas. And in the upstairs closet, they found a blanket Olivia had hand-stitched, small embroidered initials on the fabric, MCW and JEW. By late afternoon, the house was looking lighter, almost brighter. The air felt fresher, as if the house had shed some of its grief. As the boys sat on the front porch, sipping lemonade, Daniel walked back inside. There was one drawer in the toy chest he hadn't dared to open the night before. Now, he was ready. With steady hands, he slid it open, and inside, he found a faded map. It looked like a children's treasure map, drawn in colored pencils, with an X marking a spot. But as he unfolded it, he noticed a tiny note in the corner. "X doesn't mark gold. It marks growth. Look under the porch." Daniel raised an eyebrow. A treasure hunt? A part of him laughed at the absurdity of it, but another part, the part that was willing to believe in the magic of Olivia's love, felt a spark of curiosity. He grabbed a flashlight and crawled beneath the porch, the cold dirt scraping against his knees. Near the foundation, tucked inside a small tin box, he found another envelope. This one was newer, its edges crisp and clean. He opened it slowly, his hands trembling slightly. "If you found this," the letter began, "it means you stayed, that you chose the hard road, the one that leads forward, not back. I didn't know if you would. I never counted on anything, but I always hoped. You see, Daniel, our story was never about perfection. It was about love, and how love sometimes gets lost under fear, pride, and silence. But I believe in beginnings, real ones, not the kind you chase with money or power, but the kind that start with a breath and a willingness to try again. So here's what I ask. Build something. Not for me, for them, for yourself. Build a new story out of the ashes of the old one. Teach them what I couldn't. Show them that mistakes are only the end if you let them be. And if someday, when the world is quiet, you look around and see something beautiful, know that I saw it first, in you." Daniel closed his eyes, pressing the letter to his chest. His throat tightened, his chest aching with the weight of Olivia's final gift closure and permission to begin again. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the trees, Daniel sat on the front steps with Jonah and Miles. They were quiet, all three of them sitting together, the house around them feeling more like a home with each passing moment. "I'd like to fix up this house," Daniel said quietly, breaking the silence. "Make it a home again, not just for your memories, but maybe for your futures too." Jonah looked up at him, his expression softened by surprise. "You'd stay? If you'll let me," Daniel replied. Miles nodded slowly. "Maybe you could teach us some of the things you know. Business, architecture, all that." Daniel smiled, a small, genuine smile. "Only if you teach me how to laugh without a reason. Or how to make pancakes that don't taste like cardboard." Jonah snorted. "That's Miles's specialty. They laughed, a real laugh, a sound that hadn't been heard in this house for far too long. And for a moment, in the house that had once been filled with so much heartbreak, there was something else now. Healing. A new beginning. The days that followed felt like a slow, deliberate exhale after a long period of holding one's breath. The house, once full of unspoken tension and grief, began to feel different, lighter. Almost. Daniel threw himself into the renovations with a quiet determination, his hands busy with the tasks Olivia had left behind. There were no grand gestures, no sweeping declarations, just steady, persistent work that spoke volumes about his commitment to this new chapter. Jonah and Miles helped when they could, but their participation was more out of obligation than enthusiasm. It wasn't that they didn't want things to change. It was just hard to accept the idea of change itself, especially when so much had been lost. Their skepticism hung in the air like an unspoken question, one Daniel couldn't quite answer. But he didn't give up. There were mornings when Daniel found himself in the garden, trimming back the overgrown bushes that had once been Olivia's pride. He thought about how she had always tended to this space with such care, planting flowers with names he could never remember and keeping the weeds at bay. The garden had once been a place of peace for her, a sanctuary where she could escape the chaos of their lives, even if just for a moment. Now, as he knelt beside the flowers, carefully pruning the branches, he felt a quiet connection to her. It was as though she was there beside him, guiding his hands, showing him how to restore, not just the garden, but everything that had been broken between them. The boys, meanwhile, were starting to show signs of change as well. Jonah, still the quiet one, had started taking more interest in the house. He would wander through the rooms, running his fingers along the furniture, as if he were trying to remember what it felt like to call this place home. Miles, on the other hand, had started asking questions, curious questions about the past, about their mother, and about the kind of man Daniel had been before everything had fallen apart. There were moments when Daniel could see the walls the boys had built around themselves beginning to crack, but it wasn't easy. It would take time. One evening, after a long day of working on the garden, Daniel sat down on the porch swing, a tired but satisfied smile on his face. He had made real progress. Olivia's garden was beginning to look like it had been cared for, like it was loved once more. Jonah and Miles were sitting nearby, talking quietly. The house felt fuller, richer, even with the silence that sometimes lingered. For a brief moment, the weight of the past seemed to lift, and Daniel allowed himself to imagine a future where they could all find peace again. "Hey, Dad," Miles said suddenly, breaking the silence. Daniel turned to look at his son, surprised by the shift in his tone. It wasn't often that Miles initiated conversation. "Yeah? I was thinking—" Miles hesitated, his fingers tugging at the sleeve of his shirt. "Maybe we could put some of the old furniture back? You know, the stuff Mom liked?" Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected Miles to bring up Olivia. Not like this. It had been so long since she had been a part of their daily lives, and the mention of her name always felt like a jagged edge. But this time, it didn't hurt as much. "That's a good idea," Daniel said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I think she would have liked that." Jonah, who had been quiet up until now, nodded. "We could put her favorite chair by the window again. She always liked looking out at the garden." Daniel smiled, his heart swelling with pride. They were remembering her in their own way, slowly, cautiously, but with the kind of care she had always shown them. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard, Daniel felt a quiet sense of relief wash over him. It wasn't perfect. It would never be perfect. But it was enough. And as long as they kept trying, kept working, there was hope. The house was no longer just a collection of rooms filled with old memories and regrets. It was becoming something else, something new, something alive. The next morning, the sound of hammering filled the air as Daniel and the boys continued their work. The walls were coming down, both literally and figuratively. They were rebuilding, not just the house, but their relationship with each other. One small step at a time. It wasn't always easy, but it was real. The house was starting to feel like home again, and for the first time in a long time, Daniel allowed himself to believe in the possibility of a future one built not on the mistakes of the past, but on the lessons they had learned and the love they still had for each other. The gift of letting go. The weeks that followed were a blur of sawdust, paint, and the sound of tools working relentlessly to restore the house to something resembling its former self. Daniel knew that the walls held memories, that the very beams of the house were soaked in years of laughter, love, and loss. He worked day after day, feeling the weight of those memories, with every nail driven, every board replaced, every crack filled. Yet, there was something more now, an openness in the air that wasn't there before. The house was beginning to breathe, to heal, just like the family inside. Jonah and Miles slowly came around to the idea of living in this space again. There were moments when Daniel could feel the shift in their hearts, the softening of their edges. They would joke together over breakfast, and occasionally they would find themselves reminiscing about their mother. It was never forced, and it was never easy, but it was progress. Real progress. One rainy afternoon, Daniel found himself standing in the attic, dusting off boxes of old holiday decorations. He hadn't dared to look at these in years. They were reminders of Christmases past, of laughter around the tree, of Olivia's warm smile, of moments he thought were lost forever. As he pulled down a box, he caught sight of a small wooden chest tucked in the corner. His heart raced. It was a chest he hadn't opened since they moved in. It was the very chest where Olivia had kept her most treasured belongings: letters, photographs, even some old mementos from their wedding. He could still remember her fingers tracing the top of the chest, telling him how precious its contents were to her. "Do you ever wonder what might be in there?" Jonah had asked him one night, his voice curious, tentative. Daniel hadn't had an answer then, but now, standing before it, he felt something pull at him, a need to understand, to find something more than what the house had been left with. He opened the chest with a creak, unsure of what he was looking for, but feeling the weight of something unresolved. Inside, he found letters bound with ribbon, old family photos, and other small trinkets that had once meant the world to Olivia. But one item caught his attention. The last letter Olivia had written to him before she left. It wasn't like the others. This one didn't simply recount the past, nor did it express regret or sorrow. Instead, it was a letter full of hope. Daniel sat down, the letter trembling in his hands as he read. "My dearest Daniel, I don't know what the future holds, or if we'll ever find each other again. But if you're reading this, then I believe we've come full circle in our lives. I can't promise everything will be perfect, but I can promise that I've learned something crucial over the years. That love doesn't always look like we expect it to. Sometimes, Love is letting go, and I'm letting go, Daniel. For you, for me, for us. I'm not asking you to forgive me, or even to understand me. I'm simply asking you to live, to take the pieces I left behind and build something beautiful. For the boys, for yourself, and yes, for me too. The memories will always be there, Daniel, but I hope that in time, you'll learn to make new ones. Let the past be a part of you, but don't let it define you. Don't let it keep you from moving forward. I've never stopped loving you, and I don't think I ever will, but I have to let go now, and I hope you'll do the same. Yours, Olivia. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. For years, he had carried around the weight of their unfinished story, the broken pieces of a life they never fully got to live. And now, here she was, giving him permission to move forward. He closed the letter, holding it against his chest, as though it were a lifeline. The tears that came were quiet, almost imperceptible, but they were there. This wasn't about regret anymore. This was about release. This was about freedom. As he walked back down the stairs, he felt different, lighter. Somehow, Olivia had given him a gift, a precious one. She had given him the gift of letting go. Later that evening, Daniel sat down with the boys in the living room. The house was nearly done, and while there was still work to be done, there was a sense of completion in the air. The walls had been painted, the floors polished, and the old furniture was back in place. Jonah and Miles sat across from him, looking at him expectantly. Daniel paused for a moment, searching for the right words. There was so much he wanted to say, but somehow, it all felt too big to say in one sitting. I found something today, he began, his voice calm but steady. A letter from your mother. Both boys looked up at him, their expressions a mix of curiosity and caution. They had been waiting for a moment like this one, where they could finally hear something about their mother, something more than the memories they had of her. Daniel continued, She told me something important. She told me that it's okay to move forward, that it's okay to build something new. Jonah's eyes softened, his gaze shifting toward the window, lost in thought. Miles, on the other hand, looked directly at Daniel, his face a mix of skepticism and hope. You think we can do that, Dad? Miles asked quietly. The question hung in the air, heavy with uncertainty. Daniel smiled, a small but genuine smile. I think we're already doing it, he said softly. We've been doing it for a while now. The boys didn't say anything, but for the first time in years, Daniel saw a flicker of hope in their eyes. It wasn't immediate or loud, but it was there. A small seed of possibility, one that had been planted in their hearts long ago. And just like that, Daniel knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it would be worth it. In the following months, the house continued to take shape. Daniel spent hours fixing the front porch, restoring the swing that had once been a symbol of Olivia's hope for the future. The garden was brought back to life, and the house, once so full of sorrow, was becoming a home again. One evening, Jonah and Miles came to him, their faces serious. We were talking, Jonah began, his voice soft, and we wanted to ask if you'd be our dad. I mean, really. Daniel looked at them, his heart racing. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment he had feared. The future wasn't something he could control, but this moment, this was a choice. I've always been your dad, Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. But yes, if you want me to be, I'm here, for real. The boys looked at each other, then at Daniel, and in that moment, Daniel knew that they had found their way back to each other. Not perfectly, not without struggle, but they had found their way. "Thanks, Dad," Miles said quietly, his voice full of sincerity. Jonah nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, thanks." And as the sun dipped low behind the house, Daniel felt something inside him shift. The house wasn't just a home anymore. It was a symbol of everything they had survived, everything they had rebuilt, together. And for the first time in years, Daniel felt the future stretch out before him, bright, uncertain, but full of promise.